And welcome back. We are, of course, going to now work on getting ready to transition our questions, but we should also think about how we want to transition those questions. And the way we could do that is with a timer. Now, you might wonder, why are we using a timer? Well, timers are often used to add a sense of urgency, or they can help push player skill because you're putting a limit on things. And so if you think about how this is going to work for a game, our purpose for our timer needs to have several things to function correctly. For example, it needs to ask, well, what state is our game in? Are we at the point where the player can click on one of our buttons, or are those buttons no longer interactable? Are they where it's ready to display a new question? Has that timer run down to 0? Because if it's run down to 0, that technically means the player should no longer have the option to click on a question. And when the timer runs out, we also need to change that game state, right? We need to move to that next question, display the next thing. Or maybe we're going to have something like, hey, for a little bit, we're also going to show you what the correct answer was. That could be a nice way to help just, hey, I got the question wrong, but here's how it is. Which could be a good thing, like maybe if it's like a study guide or something like that. And we want to have a visual element, such as the changing of a fill amount of a graphical timer, which allows the player to easily see how much time remains, instead of necessarily relying on a countdown clock. Countdown clock can work too, but again, this is just a different way of implementation. There's multiple ways you can carry out how to do a timer. We're probably going to look at this through a graphical timer, simply because it's just a little bit thing for us to easily display. So let's jump right into Unity and get started here. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use my previous canvas and turn that on again, just to see where I kind of originally had my timer here. And you can see I had it up here as this kind of graphical element. So what I'm going to do is go to my question canvas, and I'm just going to go ahead and create a 2D object. I want to create an image in here because I want to set that up as such. And let's go ahead and call this our timer image. And I want to go ahead and move that to be right over top of this. I'm going to fill that with my timer element. You can see I have a timer right here. So if I look at my timer image, I currently have no source image. So I'm going to just drag and drop that into there. And once that's in place, we can go ahead and kind of try to resize that accordingly to try and get that to be right about the size that we want to be. And again, we can kind of move that around until we find the right size. We can adjust it as needed. And once that is set, then we can, of course, can easily come in here and say, hey, you know what, this looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and hide that previous canvas again. So that's out of the way. And you can see where that element is now up there. Now, of course, you might say, well, I'm not really happy with this color and stuff like that. For example, remember, this is an image in here. If we start playing around with these colors here, we can easily come here and start readjusting the tone of this image. So if you're not happy with the default color, you, of course, have the option to kind of play around with that a little bit to say, maybe I want this to be something that stands out just a little differently here. And if you ever need to reset that, just remember all you need to do is just click off that and you can just reset that pretty easily. Now, we're going to start with the default here just to start, because again, we can change this later on as we need to. Ultimately, what we want to do with this sprite is come over here to our image type and change it from simple to filled. And you can see we have a couple new options that pop up. First off, we have Radial 360, which means this is going to be a 360 degree fill, so it's going to operate like a circle. And we have our fill origin. We can see we have bottom, left, right, top. If I leave this at bottom and I start moving this fill amount, you'll see how it will ellipse and fill from that bottom. Now, we don't necessarily want that. We want that to more likely fill from the top. And as I spin that, you can see how that kind of spins down. Now, this is not a bad approach, but you notice it has a clockwise fill. If I want that to kind of be more of a traditional clock type timer, I can then, of course, spin this down, and you can see how that will fill. And you can see how, if we had a timer filling up, this would be a great way for this to work if it was going counterclockwise. But we're probably going to have this count down, so having it move backwards like this, counterclockwise, is probably actually going to be a pretty good option for us. Now let's pop over to our scripts folder. And I'm going to right click and create a new C# script. And this is going to be our timer script. And that's, of course, going to allow us to control things for that timer. Now, it's popping up here in Visual Studio, which is fine. But we can, of course, easily go back into Unity and we can double click that. There it is. There's our timer script. Now, we probably won't need this start method to begin with. Unless we need to initialize it or update method. But I'm going to leave those here just for a second and go back to Unity to go ahead and do a few more things here first. Now we need to take this script and attach it to an object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to my hierarchy. I'm simply just going to go ahead and create an empty object here. And let's just go ahead and call this timer. And then we can attach that timer script to it. And because we don't necessarily want to have it necessarily tied into the canvas directly, so we're just going to go ahead and have it exist here as its own object. So over here in our timer script, let's go ahead and get rid of that start method now because we know we don't need that. But we will need this update method here that we're going to go ahead and use. So we're going to leave that there in here, and let's go ahead and create first some serialized fields, because if you think about this, we're going to need to control how long we want these questions to be displayed. Now, the easiest way that we're going to keep track of this, of course, is going to be simply with some float values here, because we're simply just going to have them count down from a certain number. And so let's go ahead and create a float, and let's just call this one time to answer question. And you can go ahead and set this to whatever value that you think you want your player to have. So for example, you want 30 seconds, you can make that 30F. If you want them to have a whole minute, you would make that 60F. That's, of course, just however you feel is most comfortable for you to give the player that time. And then we're going to create a second one, because again, we want to give them a chance to review those questions. So let's call this one the time to review answer. And this one can be a lot shorter because we don't necessarily want the screen to remain up. Maybe we want to kind of keep the game moving along automatically. We can set this one, let's say, to 10 seconds, or maybe you want it to be a whole minute, or something before it elapses on. Again, that's up to you how you want to set that up. Now we're also going to need to set up just a regular float, which is going to control effectively our timer value. And that timer value, again, is going to have the value that's left over within that timer. Now, the way we're going to control this timer value is we could, of course, do this through the update method, but just so we can keep things nice and clean, we're going to create our own method. So let's just create a private method here. And let's just call this one our update timer. And what we want to do is simply just take our timer value that we have here, and we want to simply decrease it. So we can have it equal to time, this dot time though, we want this to be the delta time, because remember that it makes it frame rate independent. Now if we just set that equals to it, that is going to keep that value the same. But so we want to do is actually decrease it each time. And so there's two ways we could do this. We could have this say timer value equals timer value minus time to delta time, or we can do a minus equals, which is kind of a shortcut that we can use when we're writing this out. So instead of just using regular timer value equals timer value minus time dot delta time, we could just say timer value minus equals. Like, same thing. So just to kind of iterate that this would be exactly the same as if you had written out this. All right, these two sentences are the same. It's just this is kind of a little bit of a shorter way of writing it. So again, exact same code, but this is again a shorter way of writing it that you might see if you ever come across this kind of thing. You can see the same thing. You'll see plus equals, minus equals, times equals. These are all different ways of doing the same thing. It's just it's a shortcut. Now, of course, we want to test this because at some point we're going to have to update this. So we need to use an if statement, and so we can just use if timer value is less than 0. And what do we want that code to do when it hits that value? All right, we're actually going to make this less than or equal to, just so that we've got a little bit of buffer, because otherwise if it's less than 0, well, it's not going to be quite what we want. So, but what we want to do is set the timer value, and we want that to equal our time to answer question. And that's, of course, going to pull in this value that we have stored for it up here. And just so we can test this, let's just add in a debug.log here. And we can, of course, just add in our timer value just to see what that is actually kind of spitting out as we're working through this. And now if we want to test this out, because of course we want to make sure this is working, we can grab actually update timer here. And let's go ahead and put that here inside of update. So we'll just call update timer, open close parentheses, save that. And let's pop over into Unity and see if this is actually getting what we're expecting. So let's go ahead and start up Unity. Head on over to our console here. And you can see we are getting this timer running here. So this is, of course, if you kind of look, it is counting down, all right, from those values. And it's going 20, 21, 20, it's just counting down. And you can see it's constantly spitting this out. But you notice it is kind of moving down in those kind of increments as we might expect, because it is moving down by about 1 per second, which if you look, if we pause this, and we scroll all the way back to the start, you can see it started right at 30, which is what we would expect, because remember we said our value to start was 30F, so it's saying we have 30 seconds. Now the one thing we haven't thought about yet when we talk about this timer is how do we switch between these, right? So we need to go ahead and have another variable that's going to help us keep track of this. So we're going to make a bool here, and let's just go ahead and call this is answering question, right? because that's when the player, of course, should be working on that. And we're going to initialize that to a false value because we don't necessarily want that to be active right off the get-go. And now with this in mind, I want to go ahead and challenge you a little bit. Go ahead and think, how can we update our timer here, our code, so that way when this, for example, our timer value is 0, that we can change the state of our is answering question bool so that way it's no longer false. And what else do we need to change the timer value to be? All right, so this is actually a little bit of a tricky one. So we're actually going to keep this if statement here, and we're actually going to create what's called a nested statement. So I'm going to do an if, and I'm going to look for is answering question, and I'm going to assume that this is a true state here. And then I'm also going to need this to have a else component, and this else component is going to be when this is false. So I'm actually going to go ahead and grab this piece and put it in here. And so effectively this is going to say if the answering question is true, we're going to do a thing. Otherwise, we're going to assume this is our time to answer. So we're going to set this up with a nested statement. So you can actually put an if statement inside of another if statement. I'm going to go ahead and grab this other nested statement. I'm going to put this inside here. So I'm going to use this kind of as a setup here because what we're doing is we're saying our timer value less than or equal to 0 each time. But what I want to do in here is then I have to think about the answering of the question being changed, all right? Because remember, this is starting to be false, all right, at our get-go. So we have to go ahead and manipulate this a little bit so we can go ahead and fall into here. So let's just go ahead and copy this here because we want to, first off, set the state of this Boolean. And we're going to make sure that this is now false because our time has now run out. And instead of the answer of the question, we want this to review the answer, right? Because this is, of course, this is our answering question. This is our reviewing of that question. So I'm just going to remove this one out and change it over. Time to review answer. And then we can, of course, look at the same thing here. So I'm going to grab this is answering, and we're going to have to add this into this statement as well. However, one thing we do want to change is that this can't be false here. This now needs to be set to true because, of course, these are two different scenarios that we're effectively looking at. And so this, of course, would have to be false. This one has to be true in order for us to hit the answering of that question. And so over here in Unity, let's go ahead and test this out. And I went ahead and modified my time to answer the question down to 5 from 30, just so I can quickly test this out and see that it's going to switch from the answering question to the review answer. And so if we go ahead and run this, we can see in our console, it's counting down. We got the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, hit 0. And you can see now it's doing 9, 8. So it's now within that review answer state. And of course, once it's done with that state, it should flip back to the other state. So we now have those controls set up so that we can switch between those various states. And this, again, is just the timer. Now, we haven't tied this back into our other system, so we still have some more work to do, but the fundamental pieces are now there.